Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. What I want to discuss in today's video has to do with the self, the understanding of the self in Buddhism, and a confusion that I think some of us may get into. Now, one of the hallmarks, I would say the hallmark maybe, of the Buddhist Dharma, the Buddha's teaching, is his focus on the self. In particular, his focus on this idea that when we really look at who we are, when we focus on the self, we begin to realize that the self is a kind of an illusion in certain ways. That what we think is permanent and unchanging is in fact anything but. And this idea of self often goes by the description non-self. That's a description I've used in any number of my past videos. Non-self. It's not to say that there's absolutely no self that's out there. There is a conventional kind of self that's very real to us, that orders our lives and structures our lives in various ways. But for any kind of permanence, any kind of essential nature that's unchanging, we're going to have a hard time finding that. Now, this idea of non-self is, to be sure, confusing at times. It's complicated, it's subtle. And one way that it can be confusing and complicated and subtle lies around a distinction, I would say, between what we might call a cognitive understanding of the self and a non-cognitive understanding of the self. What do I mean by this? Well, that's what today's video is going to be about. But what I would say is that it seems to me that the Buddha understood this distinction and was trying to teach it. What do I mean? Well, let's take a very famous statement of the Buddha's. Oftentimes the Buddha would say, "Mendicants, the five aggregates are not self. And what's not self should truly be seen with right understanding like this. This is not mine, I am not this is not myself." So this seems like a pretty simple statement, but what I want to do is to try to unpack it a bit. So we begin with the first part, the five aggregates. Now, the five aggregates are a way of splitting up the human person, and indeed the entire world, into five different kinds of things. One, we might say physical thing, the body, that is, say, form is the first aggregate, and then four mental parts. We can also think of this as the world in the sense that the form aggregate exists outside of our bodies and in all of the physical things that surround us. If you want to hear more about the five aggregates, if that's confusing to you, I have lots of videos where I go into this. Again, I'll leave a link to one of those below in the notes. Okay, so the five aggregates. Now, the Buddha talks about this is not mine, that these aggregates are not mine, that these form things, that is, physical things in our environment, are not mine. I think we probably have a good sense, if we think about it, about what the Buddha is really getting at here. Ownership. Ownership isn't something that's fundamental to the world. Ownership is a kind of a social, a cultural, and a legal fiction of a certain kind. It's something that's constructed, a construct, that's made by society around laws and so on, that say that we are, quote-unquote, own certain things and don't own others. And we know also that ownership is only temporary, right? That it's not permanent. That even the things that we legally own, we'll only own so long as we're alive and able to access them, as it were. And as well, that ownership isn't complete. That is to say, we don't have complete control over any of the things that we supposedly own. Things decay, things rust, things break when we don't want them to. It's true of our own bodies as much as it's true of the world outside of us. We get old, we get sick, we die. These are things that, again, rub up against this idea of complete ownership and show ownership to be, again, temporary and conventional in a sense. Okay, that's simple enough, but what about the other two? I am not this, and this is not myself. When the Buddha says that, it sounds redundant. It sounds like he's saying the same thing twice. And indeed, that's kind of what I thought when I first ran into this statement. I thought, the Buddha sort of repeating himself here. I am not this, and this is not myself. But in fact, that's not what he's doing. He's not saying the same thing twice. And that's really what I want to get into. What is the difference between I am not this and this is not myself? Now we can see differences between these two ideas in various places in the suttas. One of these places has to do with the 10 fetters that I've gone through in a recent pair of videos. I'll leave a link to the videos down below in the notes. And indeed, in a recent video by Bhikkhu Bodhi, where Bhikkhu Bodhi, a very famous translator and scholar of the early material, discussed a similar kind of issue. I'll leave, again, a link to his video down below in the notes. He answered a question about this in that video. But basically, what we're talking about with the fetters are two different fetters. The first of the lower fetters is known as self-view, or Sakkaya Ditthi, whereas the fourth, or the third, I guess, of the higher fetters is mana, or conceit. Now, Sakkaya Ditthi, or self-view, is quite different from conceit. Self-view is a kind of a conceptual, or even maybe even a philosophical understanding of the self as something permanent, something essential to who we are. It's a kind of perhaps theoretical or theory-based idea of, let's say, a soul. There are many Western or Eastern theories of the soul in various respects that describe the sort of thing a soul is, and the way that it's either permanent or everlasting or eternal, how it's either created or uncreated, how it's identical to perhaps a consciousness or some other feature of our minds. These are all views, theories of a self. And that's what's being got when we're talking about this self-view in the fetters. Now, some of us get confused because I think we may think that getting rid of such a concept like this is the whole point of practice. I've even heard people talk about the importance of, getting rid of words like you or I, or proper names for people in our ordinary language, because that's going to sort of help uproot this idea, this concept of a self, this view of a self. However, the Buddha himself never actually recommended that we change our language. He used words like you or I or proper names all the time. It was rather that he suggested that we learn the conventional nature of language, especially in certain respects, that is to say, the language we use around people. Anyhow, if we really get caught up in trying to rid ourselves of self-view, we may think, I don't have any view of self, and yet I'm not enlightened. What's the problem here? What more do I have to do? Now, there are various responses here. One possible response is that we think we haven't gotten rid of any self-view, but in fact we have subtle self-views. That is to say, we may not believe in a certain kind of permanent essential self, but we may believe in another kind. We may, for example, believe that we are identical to our bodies in some fundamental, essential way. We may believe that we're identical to our brains. We may believe that we are identical with our consciousness, and that our consciousness is something that persists forever or eternally or everlastingly. These are ways that, even though a gross sort of self-view may not exist for us, nevertheless there may be subtle sorts of self-view that exist, even so. But here's the thing. What if we really don't have any such self-view? What if a self-view of any kind, any sort of permanent self-view, any kind of self-view doesn't really exist for us? If we've abandoned them all? What about that case? Well, indeed, such a case is brought up in the early texts. There's a discussion. There's an elderly monastic named Khemaka who is on his deathbed, and he and his companion monastics are concerned that he reach enlightenment before he dies. And his companions basically spend time quizzing him. Does he believe that any of the 5 aggregates are himself, are who he is, or that that his self owns the five aggregates in some sense. And Khemaka continually says no, that he doesn't have any view like that. He doesn't believe any of those things. And at the end of that sort of quiz, his companions then come to the conclusion that Khemaka must be enlightened. And yet Khemaka insists that he is not enlightened. That is, there is something more to enlightenment than just overcoming our wrong self-view. Views, opinions, beliefs, theories, all of these are important. All of these are important either positively or negatively, but they're not the whole picture. And it's getting deeper to that where we run into this distinction between I am not this and this is not myself. What we're talking about here is the latter part of that statement, this is not myself. That is to say, we understand that there isn't any self-theory that is going to work for us, that no matter how we construct the self-theory, we're not going to find any particular part of our experience anywhere that fits. This is a cognitive, intellectual, even philosophical way of approaching the problem. However, there's the first part of that sentence, I am not this. That is the other part. This is this subtle notion of the I. And this problem that the Buddha raises about the I isn't really about a view at all so much as what we might term an emotional stance. This is the root of the seventh fetter of conceit that we discussed earlier. Khemaka, the monk Khemaka, analogizes this to the scent of a flower that we might say persists even when the flower is gone. Khemaka himself says it's a scent of a flower that isn't identical to any of the parts of the flower. It's just something that persists in the air. And in that sense, the sense of I persists. It's a kind of it's an emotional kind of a grasping that occurs beneath the level of views, beliefs, and ideas. It's a kind of a deep, emotionally based tendency that we have, that Bhikkhu Bodhi describes it as a kind of an emotional tendency that's, again, deeper than our conceptual mind. It's the sort of thing that conceptual mind doesn't quite touch, and that it takes much more time to investigate. And I think because of this difference, I should say this difference is important to keep in mind during our practice, that there are different levels of the self or of non-self to be impacted and worked with as we progress along the path. And it's important to keep this in mind during our practice, and if you want to hear more about Khemaka's own experience, I did a separate video on Khemaka, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to see it again. Thanks so much for watching, and if you're getting something out of these videos, consider checking out my Patreon page, which is linked down below in the notes and here on the screen, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.